And here's where the gun control conversation has often seemed out of step with a rational approach to reducing these shootings. So, the focus has often on the left been on assault weapons and assault rifles, this sort of nebulous category that isn't responsible for really almost any of the daily loss of life that's happening in high violence neighborhoods. And also, the notion of gun ownership in general. There's always this paradox at the heart of the gun violence problem in America, which is that places, in cities which have a much lower rate of legal gun ownership often have the highest rates of gun violence. And that's obviously, the correlation is not causation, but it certainly challenges the idea that, well, what we need to do is or whether or not we need to do these things, it challenges the idea that getting rid of, banning certain kinds of real, semi-automatic weapons and reducing the rate of legal gun ownership is going to save lives in the places where people are losing lives every day, because so many of these guns are illegal to begin with. And operating on the black market, it's very difficult to sort of regulate, obviously. And so I'm curious to hear what is the conversation we should be having? What are the policies you feel would make it so that we don't have to read every summer that 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds are getting shot in drive-by shootings in on the south side of Chicago and East St. Louis and all of the neighborhoods we've come to take for granted as hotbeds of violence?
Yeah, so I think on the topic of the assault weapons aspect, I'm by no means specifically a firearms expert in terms of that. And, it's a common scapegoat that's used to talk about these things when, to shut down the conversation about the assault weapons and stuff. What I will say is that I think perhaps as we're having that conversation and people that are quite frankly more qualified than I am to be talking specifically on the legal dynamics of what is and is not an assault weapon, a good step that we could make is actually reducing high capacity magazine sizes and the accessibility to them, or even their legality. Because one of the biggest things is that the people in these instances of mass shootings that are using weapons like an AR-15 have that lethality oftentimes, not just because of obviously the power of the weapon in the first place, but I would say just as much the high capacity magazines that they're using that have more than 10 rounds in them. And if we have smaller magazines, it can, it takes more time for them to actually reload and allows more people to, tackle them or, someone to step in and help stop it from happening in the first place. And B, it allows that conversation that I think should be had about what is and is not an assault weapon to continue on. But in the meantime, we can take that very immediate step to talk about, in those instances, how can we stop it from being such a high casualty rate? And I think the best first step for that is a high capacity magazine ban, limiting it to something like 10 rounds, which I think, most people, even if you're just talking about the common argument, like self-defense in your home, I don't think you need 30 rounds for that, in my opinion. I think that's kind of ridiculous. But on the topic of how a lot of these guns are legal, you're right, they are oftentimes. But I think we need to realize too that there are many places where there are, separate public health issues such as smoking, where there have been black markets that have been set up in the past to avoid taxes or a number of other things. However, we still work towards regulating it, because although there are people that get out there and do things that are still illegal, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything on the legal side either. And I think that also speaks to the reason why we need basically prescriptions of policies for with nuance incorporated into them, and the way that we talk about gun violence in America, by not just talking about how does somebody get a gun legally or illegally in the first place, but also how do we prevent someone from wanting to get a gun in the first place. And that's part of the issue that I have with the debate oftentimes, is that it just stops with only talking about gun control, when in reality, I think what the conversation that really needs to be had is a conversation about gun violence prevention, and not just how do we control guns, but how do we stop people from wanting to shoot each other in the first place. And oftentimes in neighborhoods where there are high rates of gun violence, obviously they tend to be disproportionately affected by systemic racism, a history of redlining, a multitude of issues, and honestly, in my view, a centuries of compounding injustices that often results in this violence. And one of the best solutions for those communities where there are illegal guns that come in would be some system of federal regulation to help reduce interstate trafficking, so that somebody can't go and buy 30 guns in Indiana, bring them to Chicago as the South Side, like you brought up, and then sell them. Instead, they would be limited to something like one gun per month, so they couldn't, necessarily as easily go over there and sell that many guns in the first place. On top of that, we need to think about how do we prevent young people, especially who are often the perpetrators of gun violence, that are even teenagers at times, from wanting to pick up a gun. And we know from research that CDC and other agencies and think tanks and people have done, that one of the common predictors of who shoots somebody else is whether or not they or a loved one have been shot before, and it's because it's retaliation. And some of the best programs at reducing gun violence in neighborhoods like that, where there are illegal guns, are called violence intervention programs that offer community counseling and therapists and a number of other community members at the hospital to help stop retaliation from happening. And in the areas where they've done that, mind you, that doesn't necessarily have to do anything with regulating guns more whatsoever. That is simply trying to change behaviors from people from shooting each other in the first place. And in the areas where they've implemented those things, they've had pretty significant impacts at reducing gun violence. There's a conversation as well that needs to be had about the incredibly high suicide rate across America, that are 2/3 of gun deaths that are just often completely left out of the conversation. That needs a whole separate policy prescription. So there are so many different nuances in this conversation that need to be had, that I truly hate it when it just gets shut down around, do we need to control guns or not? Because in my opinion, we do need to have more gun control, but it also goes way beyond that, because we need to have behavioral intervention systems in place to help stop people from wanting to shoot each other or shoot themselves in the first place, right? And it's hard to have that nuance when it's such a loaded conversation, because I think most people could agree to some form of public health measure that helps invest in communities and not just focusing on incarcerating more people, but actually a preventative measure at stopping gun violence or stopping people from wanting to shoot each other before they shoot each other. That we know has had an impact and doesn't even have to do with regulating guns. And that's one thing that that I've advocated for. My organization that I work within, and I'm on the board of March for Our Lives, has advocated for the Biden administration, is to get more funding allocated so that we can set up better and more violence intervention programs across the country.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's a great answer. I really couldn't agree more. I know there are, this is one of those things where people, because we, as Americans, we see things happening in other parts of the country, we want there to be a solution that we can vote for to make us feel that we're in control. But often the solutions have to be local and embedded in a particular community. So, in Chicago, there's the organization called Mothers Against Senseless Killings. There's another one called Operation Lipstick. There are all of these sort of local organizations that, similar to what you mentioned, of actually, for instance, going to someone who just got shot and is in the hospital and has been raised in a culture where you can't expect, like, if you're not going to retaliate or your friends aren't going to retaliate, then basically you lose face in the community, and you've been raised in a culture where back and forth tit for tat violence is normalized, and the definition of masculinity. It's like, how do you actually stop that cycle from happening? That's a very difficult thing to do from a bureaucrat's office in DC, even from a state bureaucrat's office. And again, it's not a simple matter of gun control. I had Anthony Barksdale on this podcast a couple months ago, who is the former deputy commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department. And he told me, he was, back in the day, he was very much a tough on crime, a commissioner. But he found that he often could not bring himself to arrest someone in Baltimore who had an illegal handgun because he knew that many of the people who had them were not at all troublemakers, but knew that they lived in an extremely high violence community where they could not depend on the police to come in time to protect them and their family in the event of a home invasion. And how can you truly blame such a person, much less arrest them, when they're doing something that's totally rational? And that's part of what makes it tricky to simply say, oh, well, we just have to, toughen these gun laws.